assuming that everyone knows what we do, which is not reasonable to do, but I do think that most people do. So we have a podcast. It's somewhat philosophy oriented. I would say that the ambient guiding force is AI. I'd like to think that we're one of the least annoying AI podcasts out there, but in so doing, we're probably actually one of the most annoying ones out there. But I feel like this would be a really good group to talk this stuff through with a little bit, but we don't have to talk about AI directly because that can kind of sting you. We can kind of start up at a couple layers of abstraction and higher.
Maybe a way to frame this, because there is a richness here, we know your work and we could frame things from so many different perspectives. One of the questions that we've been trying to deal with as part of the podcast, talking to different people, and this seems like a lame ontological question, was the question of the human, that we don't really discuss anymore. The unhuman, the post-human, the inhuman, the transhuman. And one of the ideas that has emerged lately through our research over the past 2 years and so on, is that idea, we think it's still kind of relevant, of decentering humanness, removing the human from the center of all human discourse, and the question of what happens then. And that has been framed from different perspectives, I think, by different people, the different movements out there. And we've come to identify 3 things that we believe maybe we can think differently by removing the human as the kind of starting point. And by that we mean that maybe these things have not been the result of human action. They have some kind of transcendental existence, yeah? They are in a way an otherness, not part of something we've generated, but something that we participate in, something we engage with, I guess, yeah. And those 3 things to us are in a way related. And lately we've been talking a lot about computation and language. We just had a podcast with Liv Weatherby, who published a book called Writing Machines that is quite interesting, where he speaks about the divorce between language and cognition. LLMs tell us that language and cognition do not have to go together. And the third one will be technology, in the sense that instead of thinking of technology as the result of human action or something that is embedded into capitalism or forms of exploitation, power, and so on, which is true to some extent, it's also something that transcends our own existence. We are technological beings, if you will. And maybe the question that we want to raise, we are just looking for reactions, I guess, is, I don't know if you thought about this, you could react to that somehow. The idea of these 3 entities, computation, language, and technology, as transcendental entities that we discover are part of, but that are not the result of our actions.
The most dangerous thing we could do is go directly to a psychoanalyst who's going to tell us that these things are not at all dissociable from the human. If you don't mind indulging us in the thought experiment of what possibility exists for this kind of separation.
If I go from my background and what I've been working on, like towards unconscious and uses of technology and like language, and especially going with this possibility of language as being a secretion of the body. So where the anatomy of the body and the vibrations and contractions of the body is an active producer of language. So not language as this transcendental, like bared big other, as Lacan would propose, but as an immanent thing that is part of the body and the fluids and like cum and sweat. How can technology be elaborated as something that is attached to the body? So not in a transcendental way, but always in an immanent way. So in a certain way, I can really diverge from the hypothesis. Why I diverge? I'm gonna go with like this Lacanian, Brazilian Lacanian, I would say, that pretty much goes on Guattari, and why Guattari is so important, even beyond the Deleuze. I mean, if we go with like multinaturalism, and if we go with the work of like Eduardo Village Castro, everything is human. The background and the ground of everything is this human possibility of everything being human, and the differentiation is always on the natural. So it is multinaturalist and not multicultural. So the bared other would be like left out in this collaboration. So it is very much like diverging from your hypothesis. How can we explore your hypothesis with this possibility of everything actually being human?
I think like the first question that I have would be, how does this kind of conclusion dilate or expand or otherwise kind of problematize or even totally smash the idea of the human as some kind of singular thing? Like, it feels like we'll quickly get to a definitional conversation about what human is, which I'm happy to do, but that would be maybe point number 1. And then point number two, I'm thinking about Quantum Measu, for example, the famous book After Finitude, at the beginning of this hallowed century. And there's this question of the archifossil, where there is clear evidence in any kind of objective scheme of measurement that things do exist prior to the genesis of human as a thing that's recognizable to us. What does it mean for you to confront something like a fossil record then in this particular case?
Like a fossil record?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be human?
I guess like in the Decastrian sense, you could consider it human, but it's evidence of something that exists before us, right?
If we think that it's always human, it was human even beyond our possibility of elaboration of what human is.
So then we're
Because
relaxing in a point of one. Because
maybe that's the aporia of the possibility of thought. It's because it should be produced on this Thalassian like beginning of everything. So this like big soup of like possibility of life. This is already a human possibility. It's not that the human's gonna be the ultimate evolution of this like soup of life, but this is the implication. And then maybe that's the Guattarian unconscious there. I mean, you're always keeping this constant evolution of the species inside of your human body. And also Zora in my house, there's my dog and everything, and also stones and organic and inorganic. So this potentiality of human, it was always there.
There's a question there to me that taking this Deleuzian approach, if you want, where everything is human, it's also a way of decentering the human. An equal statement would be nothing is human.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Once you get to that, then we're ready,
Yeah.
in essence, on what's going on. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
It's a different approach, but reaching a similar point. But then I guess then the question is, has to do more with how would you envision then that relationship with the technological as human or the computational as human, looking at the kind of more standard approaches that people take, they establish more binary opposition between these terms.
I'd like to intervene here. This made me think about a film. I don't know if you know it. It's quite a low budget film, but it's very, very interesting, called The Stone Tape. And it's a film that is commented upon by Mark Fisher in The Weird and the Eerie. It was a film made in the 70s for the BBC, and it's a very interesting film. The plot is about a team of researchers who moves into a Victorian house to develop a new recording device. And this team of researchers very quickly discovers that one of the rooms of his Victorian house, in which they were supposed to store part of their equipment, is haunted. And in this room, which seems is being left bare since the building was erected in the Victorian era, on the stone, they see repeatedly a ghost appearing. And they hypothesize that it's literally the stone in the building which is projecting this apparition. And so they move all their equipment to this room and they start to try to detect the haunting. And it's very interesting because little by little they discover that while the building was erected in the Victorian era, there was an exorcism a few years before the building was erected, and the foundation of the building are Saxon. Then we discovered that the material, the limestone of the room was Roman, and there are all these like different strata inside the building. And so I need to spoil a bit the film. So they see the ghost of the Victorian woman appearing, but then as this ghost appears as if on a stone tape, so he appears again and again and again on a wood, and it seems that they are kind of continuing to appear. This apparition gets erased, and what was on the stone tape before this woman appears. And that's something that was before the Victorian era, before the Saxons, before the Romans, almost the beginning of mankind. And it's a very beautiful scene towards the end, but formless, colorful, almost inhuman features. Now, so this is a very beautiful film, but I'm talking about it because I think that stone as the medium of digital technology, so silicon, which is the material of which microchips are made, also has this inhuman, inorganic element to it. And I like to think about computers as bringing this inhuman, transcendental element to our culture, which is very different from our familiar organic vegetal memory of paper and so on. And I find it interesting because also there are certain technical aspects of how our digital culture has evolved, which seem to correspond more to how these mineral human materials react and respond, which means that time is very different. For a long time, we've been considering stone and minerals as if they were non-living, but starting with computers, we realized that we created literally like this mineral rhizomatic structure, which even though is inorganic, it has a life of its own almost. But to give a bigger example, like the Earth itself is a mineral structure, and it has like a its own with tectonic plates and so on. It just lives on a different time scale. And I think the internet has allowed us to peek into this different time scale. And this different time scale is not human. And I find it very interesting that the most recent development of technology, to a certain extent even artificial intelligence, open up the way to this different time scale, which maybe we don't even want to confront, and we just repress it.
Yeah, that's great. I think certainly that's something that Meyasu would love, and that we're going back to Baroque, and certainly we also hear a lot of, and this is very much in line with, I know a lot of people writing about De Castri, for example, referencing silicon intelligence or the voice of the rock script about things like that. So that makes a lot of sense. I think the question then that I have is for both of you, what does it mean that computation can be done on anything, right? You don't need to do computation on silicon. You can do computation on slime molds. You can print chips on essentially any material. You're limited by, of course, the optimization that silicon affords us if you want to do things at lightning speed. But we think that this is going to change, I mean, completely in the next 10 years. So I wonder, like for us, the idea that computation can be done on anything means that while at the same time I worship the spirit of the rock in a lot of senses, I'm like, but it seems like it's actually not even the rock. Like it's something a little bit different from that. Maybe it's electricity.
I think at least when I try to operate with this concept of, for instance, agencement, or how do we assemble things, if we start thinking from a point that we are operating in a realm of like animism, pretty much changes the way that we deal with that. Alessandro was converting with a little bit like my point. How can we deal with technology and maybe computation from an animistic?
Yeah.
And that, for instance, my idea every time when I work with like Japanese animation or even like Kurosawa Kiyoshi's films, like Pulse, for instance. I mean, there is something there that is operating in an animistic way that maybe we are not able to dominate as we think that we can dominate when we do with transcendence.
Yes.
Because I think the problem with transcendence most of the times is that I think we kind of know how to do it because we abstract it. But when we are facing like a radical other form of life, that it would be considered like lifeless. Which other futures this technology is going to bring to us?
One of the most interesting interviews that we had was with
Gordon White.
Yeah.
What I think the most famous chaos magician in the world, as far as I understand, that's how he was described to me.
such he such a deep insight into
Huge chaos.
aspects of some of the discussions that we have with computer scientists, philosophers, and so on.
Yeah, he brought us into our tech and animism game for sure.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you were saying before, I think one of the issues that is to us relevant here has to do with the idea of scale. And this is something we discussed a lot, and I think it relates to some of the aspects that you're trying to touch upon here. Scale it's something that can be discussed at length. In a way, scale is, for us as humans, we think, is a way for us to be able to engage with the complexity of reality. We have to bring everything back into the human scale so that can become countable and relatable and transmutable and communicating.
Adorable. Yeah.
Yes. And that's in a way a limitation because there are scales that we cannot understand that we still compress into our experience of reality. And that's a certain space. I think Poliks says that we hallucinate scales as humans. We keep coming up with new scales because we have to be able to communicate. But by doing so, we simplify phenomena that are much more complicated. And in a way, maybe what is happening now with some aspect of AI, LLMs, and so on, where you have a model of intelligence, a model of the basics of linguistics from a kind of a structuralist point of view that reveals something that wasn't built into the model. and it becomes complex to understand why. So in a way, that reflection is telling us that there is something there that we try to simplify that goes beyond the simplification itself.
Claire, can we bring you in? Like, what do you think about all of this?
On a sort of more simple level, like on a less kind of philosophical level, I mean, it's very trendy right now to talk about the kind of Anthropocene and to complain about the Anthropocene. So I think there is a kind of emerging kind of dissatisfaction with a kind of, let's say, human-centric kind of world that we feel like we built this entire world for ourselves and somehow flattened and compressed everything down. So I mean, this is not a sort of a philosophical elaboration by any means, but like, do you feel like you're a part of this kind of anti-Anthropocene sort of discourse, or?
No.
We're pretty morally ambiguous, I think.
What do you know?
What do you see? What do you think is the difference there? Because if I was to have people in my mind that are often talking about the question of the Anthropocene, what is the difference in your approach to this?
In the Anthropocene, I mean, just the strong principle and position that we're currently living within an entirely human-derived scale, right? That actually everything that's happening around us is principally the result of human intervention. I think we take a kind of hard alternative position there, and that's not entirely the case. And actually there's some real uncanny collaboration maybe with demonic or arumonic entities or animistic entities who are perhaps driving us in the direction that we're being driven. But to name an eon after ourselves feels, or an epoch, I guess, I don't know which one it is, but to name an epoch after ourselves is a tremendous act of hubris. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it's an excuse to make goopy art, which I don't think we're in. Right? Like it's about kind of thinking about that which we have to rot, right? And yeah, I'd like to think about who else is a part of this particular story. Not as a way to relinquish responsibility for it, but rather as a way for us to imagine any kind of alternative next step or possibility.
And now I can think about it in terms of like, let's bring it to the concept of lifting, because like, I don't know where I picked up this idea from. I think it's somewhere between the writings of Akim Stepanski and Emily Carrière, which is a really bizarre dichotomy, but they were kind of processing this idea that Immanuel Kant was just capital thinking about itself through Kant. So then we get to the problem of lifting, where like if capital itself is lifting away from the human, then is our discussion of the decentering of the human also a natural part of capital lifting away from us? And then we get to this point that, the question of what comes next. We're all anti-capitalist in some sort of broad sense, but it feels like there's a kind of exorcism where we're losing some sort of spirit of ourselves. And as the human is decentered, it seems almost as if it's a natural part of the process of capital lifting away from the human.
I think regarding this point, I would say that we reached a certain scale, which I think is the scale at which information now travels, which is light, which seems to work really well with the mineral memory we develop with computers. And at this scale, on the one hand, we're able to create all sort of content and information and compress it at this scale in a way that before was not possible. But I would think about even lifting as almost like an infrascalar activity. There is something about jumping from one scale to the other. We can also think of the Anthropocene as an infrascalar moment in history in which it's no longer only on the level of the planet, but it's on the level of interaction of its inhabitants with the planet, and so it's an infrascalar moment. And just to add another small thing, I think the interlocking of information and capital is literally this working in infrascalar way from the point of like the transportation of goods to the economy itself, which requires these passages, which I think we have enabled literally with digital communication.
I think the discussion of lift, as we try to frame it, I think we drag. We are performing as if it wasn't happening.
Yeah, as are we.
I think there's an unawareness of the when we articulate as lift in this kind of idea of exocapitalism. So the decentering of the human, to me, it's a way of bringing back the human. The way we frame it, I think, is that in that attempt to decenter, the human remains the center. because you're just adding something before it and then building a whole kind of reactive structure against something. And reactiveness in general tends to be affirmative in a way. Yes. When you become anti-something, you're actually at the same time establishing the centrality of that as something that defines who you want to be. So it's a tricky one, I think. And
Good, because you're reasserting the human in it, not as a way of centering the human, but as a way of reminding us that we have this kind of implicit bias. So
it becomes a performance of removing the human, but we still discuss the human at the same time. It's not a true move away from the centeredness of the human discourse.
I'm glad that you problematized the centering aspect of this discourse, because I have again a sort of a line that sticks in my head from Akim Stepanski is that the center doesn't exist. There's no center. Zero is the center of the number line, and it's a kind of concept. It came up yesterday that like zero is a kind of abstract concept that is not so easy to find in nature, and yet the whole of computation is built upon the idea that there is a one and there is a zero. There's this kind of like abstract center that like everything is kind of revolving around, that like it's not really there, and yet we completely live as though zero is a thing.
Would you be able to consider the movement of lifting and dragging in almost like in human terms, almost in psychological terms? Because it seems he has some affinity towards almost this bias towards the anthropocentric, this bias towards the human. It must have some kind of almost psychoanalytic existentialist ground and kind of capitalist structure we're making, and that the resistance may be almost like psychological more than, because we tend to think about it as a very rational choice. But
to me, the issue with the terminological and philosophical is with the human is that it is a project.
Yeah,
It's not what we are.
that's right.
It's what we are told that we are. And it's a project that is historical, it's westernized in a number of ways. The way we're talking about it now, we're speaking about it and we take it for granted. We know why it is, but not really. And that has been historically given to us as something that we don't need to discuss anymore. And I think that we find that itchy. We feel the need to say, what if this project may not be the right way to frame things, no?
Yeah, I guess it's, whether it's not psychological. I guess, I mean, we wrote the book for humans. I could put it that way. Well, I mean, truly, in that, like, the book is definitely designed to be read by humans as I understand a human to be, and hopefully help them kind of navigate what I consider to be more or less objective circumstances, right? And I think, like, the book in that sense, it's not journalistic, but it's definitely attempting to be descriptive in a way that theoretically allows a human to better understand, better cope, and better maneuver through a space of very hardened impossibility in a lot of respects. I think that that's what we're trying to do. And I think that has to do with both the foreclosure that certain courses of action might be impossible, and therefore the understanding that one should not do impossible things, but then also the acknowledgement that some things are impossible and that it is important to do impossible things, right? I think that's what we're trying to do. I'm not incredibly capable with psychological language or psychoanalytical language, though certainly the cons influence, obviously, in the book in some way. But to me, the book is about trying to remove psychology from the equation, right? In that there is maybe, I mean, it may be in a Deleuzian sense, there are some other psychologies at play. Yeah, and we want to try and show you that they look both.
Something that I'm interested in what Roberto said, it is like my question would be, where's the place of hallucination there? Because when we talk about like, not from psychoanalysis, but when we talk about like psychology, the problem with psychology is that psychology is full of representation. It's like emotions are representation. And I think psychoanalysis, as with Lacan would say, we are always thinking of like maybe pre-representation, as we like before any representation is produced as a feeling, for instance, as an emotion.
Yeah.
And like my question is, where is the place of hallucination? Like what a hallucination has to do with being a human, or what a hallucination has to do with lifting or not lifting?
I mean, the reference I made before to hallucination had to do more with the idea of scale.
Yeah.
And the idea there is that hallucination is meant as the creation of something that does not correspond to reality, that becomes established as such, no? And the idea that we relate to the complex of the sensorial mechanism by hallucinating it in a kind of, maybe not in a psychoanalytical way, but maybe this is just, using the language that is badly used now for AIs and so on. Scales that allow us to engage with reality. And I think the idea of using that word which Parika uses is to point out that we believe that scales in some way offer us this objective scientific representation of reality that we're able to establish through use of tools and establish scientific knowledge that establishes that this is 50 centimeters wide. Not really. There is a meter in Paris that we claim is this distance, and we divide everything accordingly. So the idea of scale as something that we have to hallucinate because it's not something that is out there, but something that we have to impose through our kind of mechanisms into reality, and then becomes shared agreement to engage with it.
Even if we think like with Kant and all the production of like concepts through Kant, if we go to Lacan, and it's a very important lecture that he gives in the seminar on ethics, that is the 7th seminar, I'm going to propose that Kant is a sadist. And because there's a sadistic, like perverse mode of existence that you need to hallucinate somehow so you can do like concepts as scales. So in a way, it's a constant production of like hallucinations that we have to territorialize in scales so we can understand the world as it is. But is it that way?
I think it brings me a little bit, you started this like animistic human is everywhere and this decentering. And I think in both assumptions, you have like this ontological core somehow. But you place it as if it is real, and maybe it might make sense to think of it from this angle of like non-philosophy and say like, there's this real out there, and it's the unilateral determination of this. And those are two forms of expressions that actually are just word buildings that are our hallucinatory assumptions about what the real might be. But in the end, that's somehow, that's the thing that's producing our percentages. And so it brings those two different, kind of to the same perspective somehow. And it might open up to us for maybe that thing with the human you're looking for is what in non-philosophy is then termed the human and human.
Yeah, exactly.
Comes to mind a very interesting article by Giuseppe Paricca. It's an article which is about scale, but he also makes this interesting connection with simulation. And I guess hallucination could be a way to express it, but simulation has this very interesting element to it, at least in the Baudrillardian sense, in which obviously any scale that is not directly accessible can be simulated, represented, and that it's as if we are groping in the dark, but we can still operate with it. And just to connect it with another very simple concept, we can assume that these mechanisms work, even though we know that, like a black box, we know that we cannot directly access it, but we can access some of it. And going back to the inhuman part, at least the component that let's say, we remove from human understanding, there is a very similar analogy that I was thinking about that was made by an Italian theorist called Furio Gesi, who was an anthropologist, and he talks about this paradox of making anthropology, because when I'm a Western anthropologist studying a non-Western civilization, in order to report this non-Western form of life in Western terms, how is this not leading to a contradiction or a paradox? And what he developed is a concept called the mythological machine, which is a paradigm in which, yes, it's impossible, but it's also possible. And it kind of takes in the contradiction, and that makes it work anyway, which has a lot of speculative realist elements to it. So I would take that these inhuman components of computation, or even the black box, could be considered as a computational machine, in the sense that there is an absurdity of projecting ourselves at that scale, becoming a machine to a full extent. And I think it's an interesting way. And simulation and the mythological machine of Furio Gesi had a very interesting similarity, I think, which really is good to think about.
Maybe I can connect to what Lane said and to the first question that you posed, because human within human could be psychotic, because a psychotic is precisely the one who lives outside of reality. because of the foreclosure of the other and so forth. So normally when we are talking about a human, we are talking about neurotic subjectivity, and neurotic subjectivity comes through repression. That is basically a way to manage the unbearable real. And this is how the humanist project comes about. And then the psychotic is someone who tries to endure this unbearable real on their own.
Yeah.
And the problem is to endure it. And through science, we are reminded that the real, without mediation, without the will, can be endured.
Yep.
We don't need extra structure for the real to be structured. So this is the psychotic point, and why the human can actually be fully decentered or fully left to dust, because we already have a proof that existence without this extra layer of mediation is possible.
Yes.
And exocapitalism as a theory is basically a theory of capitalism that confirms that on the level of the economy, computation, and the transcendental itself, because it's a first fully consistent theory of how unconstrained capitalism can be consistent. So this is basically my answer, because the problem with the real is how to make it consistent. Consistent, that it doesn't overwhelm us, that it doesn't produce hallucinations,
Actually,
it doesn't spiral into dust.
Can we deal with technology without the myth? Without the necessity of like producing mythological or myth-driven machines? Is there a possibility for that?
Humans are apathetic cognizant.
yeah,
I'm under. So I guess that's my answer.
no matter what, at the end of the day, it is happening. I promise. Like that's
Without the myth?
yeah, absolutely. It's happening in a very technical sense, you could say.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. This was so great. This was great. This is what this story should do. Thank you.
Gonna be some extra space in the podcast. I really encourage people to record some voice notes.
Hi everyone. The question of the human around which we have been rotating throughout the whole recording is something that is still extremely relevant. And despite the shifts, or at least the apparent shifts in every field of culture, in academia as well as in the arts, away from the question of the human, I feel like in this shifting away from it, it maybe paradoxically plays still an extremely important role, in the sense that what we can gather from this attempt to shift away from this question is maybe, I would say, self-driven, self-conditioned tendency of the discourse to actualize a desire for a new narrative. In general, this shift towards a new narrative, or at the very least advance the current narrative to a completely different point, which is hard to call new because we maybe have lost track of what novelty means, but I feel like this drive is definitely what has brought this project of minor publishing and this group of people together today, and this series of events that occurred this week in Venice to actuality. And I wanna add to what Max said, in the sense that I completely agree with his perspective, in that exocapitalism as a project definitely brings forth this advancement of the narrative in a way that we maybe haven't seen in the latest, 10, maybe even 50 years. Inexperienced readers, maybe somebody like me, honestly, or people who are unfamiliar with the project and with becoming impressed on what they have been doing for the past 2 to 3 years, would be quick to ascribe these texts as an accelerationist piece, but as said by Charles Mudede, is something that is much more than that. The question of the human, to move away from the human, doesn't necessarily mean to do away with the human. And to decenter it, or rather to desert the human as the main point of discourse, I feel like it would open possibilities for actual radical novelty to emerge, or at least to contribute to steer the narrative in a direction that is more sanitized or less dependent on capital per se, because as Claire said, to be anti-capitalist in the sense it still means to position yourself in relation to capital. Thank you so much to everybody for letting my voice circulate in this virtual space as a sort of ghost.